My brother called me at 6:12 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, and I remember this detail so clearly because it was early enough that the sun hadn't broken through my bedroom window yet, early enough that I was still half dreaming, early enough that I almost didn't answer. My phone had been sitting on my nightstand for months gathering dust, and I'd become the kind of person who let most calls go to voicemail, the kind of person who had somehow drifted into a corner of my own life where connection had become optional. But something made me reach for it that morning, something I can't quite explain, some invisible thread that pulled my hand across the dark and my thumb toward the green button before I'd even fully opened my eyes. It was Robert. My brother Robert. We hadn't spoken in almost 3 months, and he didn't ask how I was doing. He didn't ask if I was awake or busy or in the middle of something important. He didn't even say hello. The first words out of his mouth were clinical, measured, rehearsed in a way that made it clear he'd practiced this moment more than once, and those words were, "Dad died last night. I inherited everything. You get nothing." Then he hung up. Just like that. The line went dead, and I was left sitting there in the darkness of my bedroom, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to that dead air hum with a kind of finality that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. I remember my chest feeling tight, not from grief exactly, but from something else entirely, something closer to recognition, like I'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it, like some part of me had always suspected it would arrive in this exact way, with Robert's voice carrying it like a message he'd been tasked to deliver. And that's when I smiled. Not a sad smile. Not a shocked smile. Just a slow, knowing smile that spread across my face like I'd just understood a joke everyone else had missed, like I'd finally found the punchline to a story that had been building for years. Because my brother thought the story was over. He thought that phone call was the end, the climax, the moment where everything resolved into finality and he could hang up and get on with his life, with his inheritance, with whatever he planned to do with everything our father had spent 62 years accumulating. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have known standing in whatever room he was in when he made that call, was that I already had what he needed to lose everything. Not a weapon. Not secrets exactly, though I had plenty of those. But something far more dangerous than either of those things. I had the truth, and I had proof, and I had been waiting for the right moment to use both. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. To understand how my brother could stand in our father's house on a Tuesday morning and make a phone call like that, you need to understand who we were, all of us, the complex architecture of the Patterson family that had held together for generations before everything collapsed into dust and lawyers and lies. My father was a man named Richard Patterson, though most people called him Dick, and he was the kind of man who believed that honesty and balance were the two most important things in a human life. He'd come of age during the Second World War, had served in Europe, had come home with shrapnel still embedded in his left shoulder, and a philosophy about fairness that never wavered, not once, in all the years I knew him. He worked as an engineer, designing commercial buildings, and every single thing he built was built to last, built with integrity, built with the knowledge that people would be relying on his work to shelter them and protect them and keep them safe. My father kept handwritten journals going back to 1967, and in those journals, he documented his philosophy about inheritance and family and what he owed to his children. He wrote about wanting to split his estate equally between Robert and myself, about wanting to create a legacy that wasn't built on favoritism or impulse but on the kind of steady, methodical fairness that had governed his entire life. He had a workshop in the basement where he kept his important papers, his will, his life insurance documents, everything organized in a way that only he truly understood, and he would sometimes invite me down there, sit with me in the dusty light that came through the small basement window, and explain to me why it mattered that I understand my place in the family structure, why it was important that I know I was valued equally, that I was considered, that I was seen. Robert, on the other hand, was the charming one. He was 3 years older than me, had always been the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention, The kind of person who made jokes that landed perfectly and had friends in every circle and seemed to navigate the world with a kind of effortless grace that I'd never quite managed. He went into real estate after college, started flipping houses, and for a while it seemed like his gambles were paying off. He'd come to family dinners with stories about properties he'd bought at the right time, renovations that had turned spectacular profits, a future that seemed to be writing itself in increasingly impressive numbers. But then around 2016, something shifted. The market contracted. One of his major developments fell through. He'd borrowed heavily to finance his ventures, and suddenly those debts were coming due in ways he couldn't manage, and I started noticing changes in how he presented himself. He became more aggressive in his ambition. He'd make comments about needing to make certain deals work out, about needing capital injections from somewhere, and while he never said it directly, there was a subtext to his conversations that was impossible to miss. He needed money. More specifically, he needed our father's money. My father's health began its slow decline around 2018. It didn't happen all at once. It was the kind of decline that sneaks up on you, the kind where you don't realize how much has changed until you step back and see the trajectory all at once. He started forgetting small things. He'd repeat stories he'd already told days before. He'd lose his place in conversations. The doctors said it was normal aging, that some cognitive decline was natural, that there was nothing to worry about yet, but I could see the fear in my father's eyes when he forgot something he knew he should remember, that particular look of frustration and confusion that comes when your own mind becomes unreliable. And Robert was suddenly very present, very attentive. He'd appear at my father's house with increasing frequency, ostensibly to help, to check on him, to make sure he was managing okay on his own after my mother passed away in 2017. He'd offer to drive him to appointments. He'd take over managing his medications. He'd help him organize his paperwork, and he'd do all of this with such apparent devotion that if you weren't paying close attention, you would have thought he was the most loving son a man could ask for. But I was paying attention. I was always paying attention. I'd come by for Sunday dinners and notice that Robert would hover near my father, would redirect conversations when they went in certain directions, would gently suggest that my father was more tired than he thought, that maybe he should get some rest, that maybe it was time for him to start thinking about the future in a different way. I'd noticed that my father seemed less inclined to discuss his will during these visits, that he'd deflect when I brought it up, that there was a tension in the room that hadn't existed before. And in March of 2019, I found something that made everything clear. I'd come by to help my father with his taxes, a task he'd asked me to handle because his vision was getting worse, and he hated dealing with the paperwork regardless. He was asleep in his chair when I arrived, so I let myself into his study and started organizing the documents he'd mentioned on the phone. That's when I saw it. A folder marked estate planning, and inside it a new will. Not the one I'd seen before, the one that split everything equally between Robert and me. This was different. This one left the bulk of his estate to Robert, with a small bequest to me and a note in my father's handwriting that said something about wanting to ensure Robert's future was secure given his business ventures. But here's where it gets interesting. The handwriting was wrong. Not obviously wrong, not something that would jump out at someone who didn't know my father the way I did, but wrong nonetheless. My father had a very distinctive way of forming his capital letters, a particular slant to his script that had been consistent for decades. I had boxes of his journals upstairs in my apartment, and I'd spent enough time studying his writing over the years that I could spot the difference immediately. The signature on this new will was close, but it wasn't quite right. It was someone trying to copy my father's handwriting, someone who'd studied it carefully but hadn't quite captured the specific angle of the R in Richard or the way he always made his D slightly larger than the other letters. I stood there in that study for what felt like an eternity, holding that document in my shaking hands, and I understood immediately what had happened. Robert had forged this will. Or, more likely, he got my father to sign something while his cognitive capacity was questionable, something that my father might not have fully understood. Something that took advantage of a window of time when my father was vulnerable and confused and open to suggestion. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just theft. It wasn't just betrayal. It was fraud. It was elder abuse. It was a crime, and it was sitting in a folder on my father's desk waiting to be discovered. I made a decision in that moment that I've had to defend to myself 1,000 times over the years since. I didn't confront Robert. I didn't take the document to a lawyer immediately. Instead, I photographed it. I took dozens of pictures from multiple angles, with careful attention to the signature, and I stored those images on a secure cloud server that only I could access. Then I put the will back exactly where I'd found it, and I went upstairs and woke my father, and we had tea and talked about his garden and the weather and all the small things that families talk about, and I didn't mention what I'd discovered. I did something else instead. I started documenting everything. I began keeping meticulous records of every time Robert visited, every conversation I overheard through my father's phone line when I'd call, every small change in my father's physical or mental condition. I collected copies of bank statements that showed unusual withdrawals. I found evidence that the lawyer who'd drawn up this new will was someone Robert had suddenly started seeing, someone who'd done work for his real estate ventures, someone who had every reason to want to stay in his good graces. I hired a private investigator. I know how that sounds. I know how it sounds like I was obsessed, and maybe I was, but I also knew something that Robert didn't know. I knew that our father had left provisions in a secondary trust, a trust that he'd set up in 1994 and had updated regularly, a trust that I'd known about because he'd told me about it years before when the dementia hadn't started, and he was still completely himself. This trust had a contingency clause built into it. If my father's will was ever determined to be fraudulent, if his mental capacity was ever questioned during the period in which that will was created, the entire estate would pass not to the beneficiary of the fraudulent will, but into the secondary trust, which would be administered by an independent trustee for the benefit of both of his children equally. He told me about this trust when I was 23 years old, sitting in that basement workshop with dust motes floating through the late afternoon light, and he'd explained to me that he wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, if anyone ever tried to take advantage of his estate, there would be safeguards in place. He'd made me promise not to tell anyone, and I hadn't. Not a soul. I kept that information locked in my mind for 17 years, and it became the foundation for everything that happened next. My father died on the morning of November 12, 2021. Robert called the hospital and told them he was the primary contact, he was the one who needed to be notified, and he was the one who got the first call. He went to the hospital and spent time with my father's body before I even knew he was gone. He made arrangements with the funeral home. He contacted the lawyer who'd been handling the forged will. And he did all of this before I even had a chance to say goodbye to my father. When I arrived at the hospital, my father was already being moved to the funeral home. Robert was in the hallway, and he told me that he was handling everything, that Dad had already made his wishes clear, that there wasn't anything for me to do except grieve. And I remember standing there looking at my brother's face, seeing the barely concealed satisfaction there, the sense that he'd finally achieved something, and I felt that smile starting to form again, that same knowing smile I'd felt when he made that phone call to tell me I'd inherited nothing. Because Robert didn't know that I had 17 years of documentation. He didn't know that I'd been building a case since the moment I saw that forged signature. He didn't know that the private investigator I'd hired had uncovered evidence of financial coercion, of meetings between Robert and a neurologist who'd been paid to downgrade my father's mental capacity assessment, of a web of corruption and betrayal that was far deeper and more calculated than even I had realized. He didn't know that I'd already consulted with 3 different estate lawyers, all of whom had told me the same thing: you have enough evidence to challenge this will, and you have a very good chance of winning. So when Robert hung up that phone after telling me I got nothing, I wasn't devastated. I wasn't angry in that way that makes you act rashly or emotionally. I was calm. I was prepared. I was ready. The legal process took 7 months. 7 months of depositions and document reviews and expert testimony. Robert hired attorneys to defend the will, expensive attorneys from a firm in the city, and they fought hard. They brought in handwriting experts of their own who testified that the signature on the will was consistent with my father's natural aging and variation in his handwriting. They argued that my father had been fully competent, that his cognitive decline was minimal and not relevant to his decision-making capacity. They painted me as a jealous daughter trying to steal her brother's inheritance, as someone motivated by greed and resentment. But they didn't have what I had. They didn't have the photographs of the forged signature with the angle measurements that showed clear deviation from my father's established pattern. They didn't have the medical records from an independent neurologist showing that my father had been in a mild state of dementia during the relevant period. They didn't have the bank records showing Robert's debts and his financial desperation. They didn't have the testimony from the investigator who'd uncovered the payments to the first neurologist, the one who'd concluded my father was competent despite clear evidence to the contrary. And they didn't have the secondary trust. When I presented that document in court, when I explained my father's contingency plan, when I showed the judge that my father had anticipated exactly this kind of scenario and had put safeguards in place, something shifted in the room. Robert was sitting across from me, and for the first time, I saw him understand that I'd been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. That I hadn't just stumbled onto this situation. That I'd been preparing for this moment since long before my father even died. The judge ruled in my favor in a decision that took 3 hours to read. The will was deemed fraudulent. My father's mental capacity during the period in which the forged will was created was deemed compromised. The entire estate, including the substantial assets Robert had already begun to liquidate, was frozen pending transfer to the secondary trust. An investigation was launched into the neurologist who'd provided false testimony, into the lawyer who'd drawn up the fraudulent will, into Robert's financial history. Charges were eventually filed. Not for the forged will directly because that was a civil matter, but for elder fraud, for financial exploitation of an incapacitated person, for conspiracy. Robert took a plea deal. He did 18 months in a federal facility. The attorney's fees cost him nearly $1 million. The reputation damage was worse. Every real estate deal he'd worked on in the previous 5 years came under scrutiny. Some of his business associates abandoned him. His wife left him. His friends disappeared. And the inheritance that he'd felt so certain about, the money he'd been so desperate to secure, eventually passed into the trust, where it was divided equally between the two of us, just as my father had intended all along. That's the practical resolution. That's the legal outcome, the part that plays well in the narrative of justice served and karma catching up. But the real story, the part that matters, is something else entirely. I've spent the time since that verdict understanding what my father was trying to tell me when he explained that secondary trust 17 years ago, sitting in his workshop with the afternoon light streaming in. He was telling me that he trusted me. He was telling me that he believed I would be the one to protect his legacy, not because I was the favored child, but because I was the one paying attention. He was telling me that inheritance isn't about money at all. It's not about assets or property or bank accounts. Inheritance is about character. It's about the values that get passed down from one generation to the next. It's about being the kind of person who notices when something is wrong, who has the courage to act on that knowledge, who refuses to let injustice win just because it's easier to stay silent. My brother looked at me during the verdict, and he didn't look angry. He looked broken. He looked like someone who'd believed a certain story about himself, a story where he was clever and capable and deserving, and he'd suddenly discovered that the entire foundation of that story was false. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sad. I felt the weight of having to be the person who uncovered my own brother's crimes, who had to sit in that courtroom and watch him be led away, who had to stand at my father's grave, knowing that I'd honored his memory by destroying my relationship with my brother. But I also felt something else. I felt the satisfaction of knowing that my father's wishes had been honored. I felt the knowledge that justice, real justice, isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about making sure that things return to the way they were supposed to be, that systems work the way they're designed to work, that integrity isn't something that gets traded away for convenience or profit. My father wrote in his journals that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when no one knows the difference. It's what they choose when the easy choice and the right choice diverge completely. He wrote about honor and balance, and the kind of life that lets you sleep at night knowing you've done the hard thing instead of the simple thing. He lived that way. And in the end, through his secondary trust, through the contingency clause he'd designed, through the act of trusting me with information that seemed arcane at the time, but became the foundation for everything that followed, he made sure that I understood what he was trying to teach me. That inheritance isn't just about money. It's about becoming the kind of person who can be trusted with truth. It's about having the strength to act on what you know even when acting means destroying something precious. It's about being willing to be the villain in someone else's story, if that's what justice requires. If you have aging parents right now, if you're watching from somewhere and you're thinking about your own family structure, your own vulnerabilities, your own potential fractures, don't wait until it's too late to pay attention. Don't wait until someone is sick or dying to start asking questions about your family's finances, about who has access to medical decisions, about what happens if the wrong person gains control. Talk to your parents about their wishes, while they're still completely clear-minded.
Put safeguards in place.
Not because you're expecting betrayal, but because the people who betray us are almost always the ones we trusted. This is the story I wanted to tell you today, and I'm grateful that you stayed with me through all of it. I know it's long. I know it's heavy. I know it doesn't end with everyone hugging and reconciling. But it ends with the truth winning. It ends with my father being honored. It ends with me understanding that paying attention, staying alert, and being willing to do the hard thing is the real inheritance, the only one that matters. What would you have done? Did you see the twist coming? Could you have acted with the kind of patience I had, waiting 17 years to use the information you possessed? These are the questions I ask myself late at night, the ones that don't have clean answers. I ask them because I want to know who I became through all of this, what I sacrificed, what I gained, and whether the version of myself that emerged from the other side of that verdict is someone I recognize or someone I've left behind. And that, more than any amount of money, more than any legal victory, is what this story is really about. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And if you found this story compelling, if it resonated with something in your own experience, please subscribe to all of Revenge Stories. Please share this with anyone you think needs to hear it. Because stories like this one, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, stories about justice and family, and the complicated ways we protect the people we love, these stories deserve to be told and heard and remembered. They deserve to be anything but silent.